Okay, well, I think we will go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody. My name's Peter. I'm a co-director here at Amplify, and we're really excited to have you all here tonight for our alternate currents panel discussion, Cultivating Queerness, Artistic Practice in Rural Spaces, with our three wonderful panelists, Patrick Costello, Benjy Russell, and Jared Packard. Jared's also going to be guiding the discussion, and in just a minute, they'll all introduce themselves to you. But before that, for anyone who's new to Amplify or for anyone who's joining us for the first time, we're a nonprofit arts incubator dedicated to supporting artist-driven change. And Alternate Currents is one program that helps us do that by contextualizing national and international issues in the arts with responses from people working on the ground. So tonight's discussion is just one part of a year-long investigation of place and the different social and economic and environmental dimensions that shape our understanding of what it means to be in, of, or from a place. So our panelists will be in conversation with each other for about 45 minutes before we open the floor to questions, but the Q&A and chat functions are going to be active throughout the conversation. So please feel free to share your thoughts there anytime. I'll also mention just really quickly that a video and a transcript of this discussion will be posted to the Alternate Currents blog with additional resources in just a couple weeks. So you can revisit it there and find a lot of other great discussions like this one under the conversation tab on our website. That's just amplifyarts.org. So thank you all again for being here. We really appreciate your participation and your willingness to engage in critical discussion with us. Thank you to the Sherwood Foundation, whose support makes this program possible. And with that, I will pass it over to Jared.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, to Amplify Arts too. Peter and Amplify do such a great job throwing urgent, dynamic conversations out into the public sphere here in Omaha, regionally, and through the power of technology, nationally and internationally, I suppose. I don't know if we have international visitors tonight, but hi, if you are here. I'm going to let our two amazing panelists introduce themselves. If y'all can share a little bit about your background, your practice, any kind of like framing information that can get people primed, palates or appetites whetted. Is what I was trying to say. Yeah, go ahead, Benjy, if you want to start.
My name is Benjy Russell. I'm a Choctaw artist. I am originally from very rural Oklahoma. I grew up in the country outside of a little one-horse town, population like 1,500 or so. Lived there for the first 25 years of my life, and I've been here in rural Tennessee for the last 14 years. Here in Tennessee, I'm very grateful to be living in like an intentional rural queer community. So there's a lot of queer folks who have been doing country life out here for a long time and figuring out how community works and all of that. I'm a photographer is my main art form. I do video work and sculpture as well. I work in a lot of like surrealism, and I use a lot of in-camera effects. So I don't do a lot of like Photoshop or post editing or anything like that. So I try to do everything in camera. Yeah, I've been here for 14 years. A little background on my work and what informs it these days is about 8 years ago, my husband and I were diagnosed with AIDS. He passed away within about 8 months of our diagnosis. And so this idea and this concept of how place and relationship and love evolves through death and transmutation, sussing out what happens after this via quantum mechanics or what have you. Yeah.
Thank you for that, Benjy. Patrick, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Patrick. I use he, him. Oh, it says my internet connection is unstable. Hopefully that's a passing thing. I say I'm from Charlottesville, Virginia, but I was born in California and I grew up in my dad was in the Navy, so I grew up moving around quite a bit. I grew up on military bases and suburban communities, and I come from from people who were farmers and worked in the military and drove trucks. And I'm pretty close with my grandparents who live in Idaho. And that was kind of my early introduction to a more rural framework or like history, family history. I live currently between New York City and Athens, New York, which is about 2 hours north of the city. New York City is Lenape territory, and Athens is Mohican territory. I have 11 and a half acres upstate that I own with my partner, Ben. And it is an amazing piece of land that has some like oak hickory forest and hardwood swamp forest and red cedar forest. And at the center, we've kind of cleared a space for a planted meadow and a bunch of different natural building projects. So yeah, and then a little bit about my practice. I feel like my art takes many different forms. I don't have a medium that I kind of specialize in, but my background is in printmaking, and I do a lot of performance and installation. And I think my work oftentimes comes from thinking about my body or my identity or my personal history in relation to specific ecosystems. So there's a lot of like thinking about plants and place and plants and place.
Love it. Thank you. And I'm Jared Packard. I am calling in from Omaha, Nebraska. I am an artist and a curator. I'm a disenchanted painter who at once loves painting, but like I'm so frustrated by it, which has really propelled me into my curatorial practice. Really interested in how capitalism kind of forges and unmakes identities and how we construct and perform identity. I'm feeling a little bit like an imposter tonight because I don't have like in-depth personal histories in rural spaces. I've been living in Omaha for 3 to 4 years now. And so I'm kind of positioning myself as a learner from you two and eager to kind of like tease out some of the experiences you've had. But part of that experience and moving to Omaha is kind of like realizing the relativity of kind of urban rural spectrum. A lot of the folks that in urban centers that found out I was moving to Omaha were like, oh, that's in the boonies. And yet when I moved here, I'm meeting like queer folks who are coming in from Western Nebraska who are like, this is the big city, right? There's like this real spectrum of like how we perceive and experience rural and urban conditions. And I think a lot of what I'm particularly excited about in this conversation is thinking about how a lot of prevalent queer histories and narratives are synonymous with urban spaces. We think first and foremost of places like New York City or San Francisco, maybe London or Berlin, as kind of sites for queer identities to have been born and flourish. And so I'm really excited to kind of expand and broaden some of those ideas and think through what some of like what queer identities might look like and have looked like in less urban spaces. So I guess with that in mind, you both shared a little bit about kind of the logistics of your relationship to rural spaces as queer practicing artists. I'm wondering if you can give us a little insight into like the psychological and emotional kind of lifestyle that you have to those places.
So I grew up in a very rural area. Like my closest neighbor was like a little dot on the horizon that you could see like miles away. So like rural space always held this like fantastical, magical possibility. You were allowed just like so much room to run amok and create and do whatever you want. And my art practice has always existed trying to create the super fantastical and like a magical, realistic version of what we are living in. So I was constantly using as a backdrop and something that could I could use to evolve and change through a camera into something else, something a little more heightened and fantastical. But it was also very isolating. I mean, especially as a queer pre-app, beginnings of internet. It was isolating. It was, it's very lonely out there. The apps have changed it a little bit, but still people like queer folks don't want to live in rural areas because there's not that much support. And so when I moved in to Tennessee in this already set up system of like amazing people, amazing queer folks have already been doing it for generations out here. It changed everything. I mean, I had no idea that this could exist. Yeah, so I think it's informed a lot and allowed me to like look at this place as some place that will probably be buried somewhere around the property or something,
That's great. And I'm curious to maybe in a minute come back to kind of that legacy that you're tapping into. Patrick, it sounds like your experience is more about straddling these two worlds of urban and rural, and I'm wondering if you can give us some insight into that.
Yeah, and I think that like even more than straddling, I just sort of, because I grew up moving around and because my family all has different experiences on this kind of urban rural continuum, I sort of have this weird like I both heavily identify with my family's history as like Idaho potato farmers and like truck drivers out west, and also like a my own little personal experience of being like a community organizer in Appalachia in my 20s. And then also being a young kid who was like, I just want to go to where there are people like me. And so desperately wanting to go to New York because that's the only place that I knew that could have that. And we went there on a class trip, and we came to New York on a class trip in 8th grade, and I was like, oh my gosh, we went to Tower Records and saw Les Mis, and I just remember being like, this is it. And so I have this really funny relationship because I feel like it wasn't until I started to learn about places or visit places like kind of where Benjy lives, and also going on tours, seeing like the Wagenplatzes in Europe that are like outside of towns, and starting to have friends who were back to the land homesteading and starting to be like interested in permaculture and gardening, that I was like, oh, wait, maybe actually so much of what I care about is actually located in this rural space that until that point had just been one of the many kind of options or thoughts for where I might be and live and make.
Yeah, I'm really interested in this idea of like, Benjy, you called it kind of like this magical kind of landscape of like possibility maybe, and like both, it seems like that's something that both of you are tapping into. Benjy, you talked about kind of like this existing history that you jumped in on. Can you share a little bit about what that is? I'm not very familiar with what kind of communities you're surrounded by.
Oh yeah, so I live in Middle Tennessee, on stolen Yuchi land. And part of the Back to the Land movement that happened in the 70s trickled out into this rural area because land was so cheap. One of my neighbors, who's one of the elders, found this place, placed an ad in Mother Earth News back in the 70s and said, land is cheap, there's water everywhere. If anybody wants to form a community, come on out. And then the Radical Fairies set up a community at Short Mountain Sanctuary The Radical Fairies were kind of this like cis gay male separatist movement that came out of the 60s, where men were able to like play with like sexuality and gender and drag and all of these things. And so they have had a community set up since the late 70s, early 80s. There's probably about a dozen residents that live there full time. They host several large gatherings a year where, you know, queer gay folks come out from all over the world to revel in nature and, you know, get right with goddess and all that. And then there's another community nearby called Ida, which is more of Black trans anarchist kind of vibe. And they're both doing amazing work right now, and I've seen them do there's a lot of evolution going on in the process, and it's been so cool to watch.
Thanks for sharing. Yeah, that makes me kind of like this as like a canvas on which to kind of enter a new stage of self or a new kind of expression of community. Has me wondering about what that has done, that environment has done for your creative practices. I'm wondering if you can share a little bit about how you've grown as an artist, or you use these spaces as like a foundation for what you're doing creatively.
Do you want to go first?
No, you go ahead.
Okay. I bought land in Athens because I had been living collectively in New York City for almost 8 years, and what was interesting to me about living collectively was that oftentimes, well, both times that I did it was with the same folks, and we lived in spaces where we had gardens on the rooftop and where it was just these huge, big warehouses where we would have space to make and to have our rooms and to build out the kitchen ourselves and all of these things. And I was really interested in the way that this tiny community of people that I was living with we were kind of like making our own little world within the larger city. And I like that in a rural space or on a land project, you're immediately expected to do that. Like you have to. There's no other option if you want to be able to like literally sleep indoors or like, and so I was really craving the kinds of skills and knowledge that I think rural living and land projects enable. So I was just like, I want to know more about the plants and the mushrooms and animal identification. I want to tap sugar maples to make syrup. I want to compost my poop. I want to make big collaborative spectacles in collaboration with moths and people and creatures of the night. I want to have a brass band come out of the woods. I want to like and have no one tell me I can't. I want to like see the ways in which I can increase the amount of pollinators in a space. So all of those things felt like creative acts, and they only felt possible if I were able to have access to a larger outdoor kind of raw space. So yeah, that's where I think that answers the question, or yeah, that's where that kind of intersection happens for me.
So my work, I shoot a lot of my work outdoors. So nature kind of acts as like the second subject and also backdrop of everything. It kind of just informs all of the work. And like being out here for such an extended period of time, you get to like watch how the seasons change. And so suddenly you notice the like smallest nuance in Oh, the buttercups are about to flush, or oh, this is happening this week, or oh, like this is a new bird that came in. And all of those things can prompt work, like, so you like are really studying the smallest, tiniest shift in seasons or in the environment, and it just prompts long form work. I like to say that like nature is the muse, but it's also the subject as well.
Yeah,
Yes.
and it is long.
Yeah, it is long
It's like
form.
really small, really big, really short, really long. Like the
Exactly.
time scale is so different than it is in the city.
Yeah, it really is. And you notice as soon as a new bird comes through or a new sound gets made, you're like, oh, the season is shifting this direction because now this is happening. I just closed a huge show here at my house where I made all of this work during the pandemic, and I didn't want to show it in a gallery space. So I started growing this like 7,000 square foot garden that was the anchor of this show that I hung. Like I ended up having all the photographs printed on outdoor fabric and displayed around like the wildflower planting.
Cool.
And so I was able to invite like people into my home, like very intimately, and like show them this work that dealt with like a lot of very complicated and complex issues, and also be surrounded by butterflies and can like take a nap if you want, like have a picnic. So it's a really that's a really like interesting way that I hadn't pictured my art form going, but it's been lovely, and I love having it as a gallery space. So I think I'm going to keep doing that. So like there'll be a place out here in the country where people can come and look at really amazing art in nature and not hear any man-made sounds or anything, dream a little bit.
Yeah, that anecdote, the show that you did makes me think about like what a stark contrast to like the hierarchical institutional world that we're accustomed to.
Absolutely.
And it's like, as you were talking, like, this is really showing how I feel like an imposter, because I'm just like, how romantic, how beautiful, like the butterflies and like the shot, everyone just shows like that. I'm like, I don't have the experience that y'all have. But I'm thinking about like the skepticism of institutions and traditions that have like really been refreshed and awakened in recent years across the political spectrum, and like most notably in this context, kind of like skepticism of the art world, and how those institutions within the art world are not feeling like they're meeting kind of like their promises or serving their communities or artists. And I'm curious to hear a little bit more about what are some of the rewards that you found kind of operating outside of some of those parameters.
Patrick?
That's interesting, because I feel like one of the things that I always think about is that if I want to continue being an artist that's contributing to a discourse or to some kind of framework that includes institutions and kind of conversations outside of just my house or my piece of land, then there's always going to be a tension there. Like I'm never going to be able to like escape it by going to the woods. And I'm also sort of interested in how I intentionally invite those kinds of things into the woods or into my land project. And I guess one of the more recent projects that I did with a bunch of collaborators on our land was that we had a bunch of scientists from Cornell that came to the land and a bunch of friends from Philly and New York. And I made this event happen with collaborator Ash Frolito, who is an artist based in Ithaca, New York. And we hosted this big thing called Mothball that was like a 7-course banquet dinner on a big long table set in the field, and all of the food was moth themed. And then we like made art together. We made all the tablecloths out of cyanotypes, and there were all these artists from all over the place that were involved. And then it sort of the banquet dinner culminated in an original song written by my friend Chenda that we all sang together to call in the moths. And then the lights went up on these sheets and we engaged in this activity called mothing, which is like a low-tech scientific activity where you turn a light on a white sheet, and the moths flock to it. And then that's actually how scientists track and identify moth populations in an area, because about 90% of moth species are nocturnal. And so you can and respond to light in that way. So we had all these scientists then go around, and the actual like performance really begins at that point in the darkness. And I lost my train of thought because I was talking about mothball, but where you asked, and I get so worked up when I'm talking about mothball, but you asked.
I asked about I can understand how you would lose track of things because that was really fascinating. But I asked about the rewards of like operating outside of kind of like art institutions.
Oh yeah. And so I guess to me that event sort of holds those tensions within it, where I was like, I'm making an art project. I'm involving actual people from actual institutions and from New York City and from all these things. And it's specifically very much about this hyper local place where this land project is, and the like more than human species that are creatures that live there. And so I guess just like that's how I'm approaching that question of like moving away from a city or moving away from a certain kind of framework that feels oppressive. It's sort of like, maybe the rural space just allows me to interface with it in a more intentional way.
So it took me a little longer to get to a point where I recognized the richness of creating work and not being reliant on institutions. I moved here from LA. So I moved from Oklahoma to LA for about 4 or 5 years. And when I was in LA, I was getting all of these opportunities thrown at me, like international shows. And at some point I decided I needed to move back to the country because that's where my heart's at. And as soon as I moved back here, within like 6 months or so, every single opportunity dried up, every single offer for a show dried up. Like if you are not in their faces and if you're not in those events and you're not at the shows, then like people don't really, especially people who make decisions, don't really remember who you are. And so at this point, like I haven't really shown in a gallery in probably like 8 years. Nobody's asking me. I'm not a hyper networker, obviously, because I live in the middle of nowhere. So I'm just kind of like, I show when the opportunity presents. I don't stop making work, it doesn't slow the process down at all. And you find new ways to exhibit it. But it doesn't stop you from making the work.
Yeah.
I asked about like the rewards of working at it, but I think both of you kind of pointed to some of the limitations of it too. And I think that is a helpful kind of like dichotomy to hold in the same space. When you talk about like the richness of making work, there is something like, for lack of a better word, like pure about operating outside of like without kind of these external forms of validation or
you have a clarity of thought at that point because you're not reliant on anything other than the art and other than the message that you're working on. And that's all that's important then at that point. There's a level of purity, I guess, at that point.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it also sort of points to the fact that within queer community in rural and urban spaces, there's always been this heightened importance of like subcultural spaces that are like just for us. And in a rural space, you really get to like calibrate who that just for us is and how you get to like decide that the audience is the pollinators in my wildflower garden, the people who come to visit me to see the work, and the like it's not going to be, you just really get to sort of, there's this opportunity to really be specific about who the work is for and how it gets presented. And I feel like, yeah, I don't know if I would call it purity, but it is this like really intense, because it all feels kind of muddled to me as a person who's darting between the two spaces, but it does feel really like potent.
Yeah, I really like that idea of kind of like intentionality and specificity around kind of the communities and the work that you're making in rural spaces. I think about like, you know, urban centers are heralded as kind of like hubs of innovation, because there is this like huge influx of different cultural backgrounds, and like the possibility of encountering difference, you know, new ideas is like an increase of, you know, there's more of a chance of like a new idea or yeah, creativity or something. But I'm really resonating and appreciating kind of like maybe like the foil to that, so to speak, in offering kind of like a space for intentionality, which feels like so challenging to do in like a digital age right now. I'm curious to hear a little bit more about like you shared about your like moth experience, but like what are some of like the possibilities around communing with and learning from like non-human entities? You mentioned mushrooms or flowers or butterflies, and I'm curious about what kind of inspiration or projects have emerged from like those kinds of relationships.
So when I first moved here to Tennessee, there was this spot where I'd go and pee off the front porch every morning. And after a few months, I noticed it was where all the butterflies gathered. So I came up with this idea where I wanted to show this juxtaposition of like beauty and like, you know, really rough masculinity. And so my husband, or my boyfriend at the time, for 2 weeks straight, every morning we'd go out there and pee on my chainsaw every morning. And then the final piece is like suspended with magician's wire in the woods. And within like 20 to 30 minutes of hanging up this like piss-soaked chainsaw, all of these butterflies came in and were like eating all of the like minerals and urea off the top of it. But I love that like act of us doing that as this ritual. And then like that was kind of the birth of the relationship a little bit. But I never would have put two and two together until I noticed that where you pee off the porch is where the butterflies eat.
Yeah, I so much of my more recent work has been about since 2009, the way that I know they tell you that being an artist is very lucrative and glamorous, but so far that the glamorous part is true, but other than that, not so lucrative. So I make my money as working in horticulture. So I never had a job in New York City until just September. I've never had a job where I worked indoors. So I work with plants, and I have a lot of like, I guess I would say expertise around plants. And so going to a space where I can like both witness what comes up naturally and work with it with my kind of like years of expertise has been so cool. And I've kind of translated that knowledge and experience into a series of sculptures that have been just gardens. And so I'm interested in what it looks like to make art that is purely plant-based and that will go away. And so that's a thing that has flourished in my since we've gotten land.
That makes me think about something we haven't touched on yet, but in terms of kind of like thinking about climate change and our current ecological crisis, and I'm curious to think about questions around like sustainability or living off grid, how your time in rural spaces has like, or whether how you see your kind of creative practice engaging some of those concerns.
I mean, I think when you live in a rural area, you just automatically at some point you look at yourself as the caretaker of the land and like trying to facilitate what the weird little microclimates within it needs and like what the birds need and what the plants want to live there. I mean, I don't think you can help that. You can't like battle nature, you know? So I think you just like turn yourself over to it and you start to just take care of it at some point and do the best you can.
Yeah, I guess I kind of think that like in terms of climate crisis, people in rural and urban communities all over the world are starting to experience all of the things, all of the disasters and intense changes that we're going to see more of. And that was definitely part of my reasoning for wanting to start a land project, was that I was kind of like, when there is a crisis and people are migrating out of cities, I want to be able to like give them a place to be. And when there are situations where we can take care of the land, like Benjy was saying, I want to be one of the people that can use my body to do that. And it sort of feels like all of these questions around climate change, yeah, it really brings up a bunch for me around what it looks like to be a steward of land and of place, whether you live rurally or in an urban space. And, you know, I don't know how much we can actually do when the forces are that big, like when it's so far outside of our control, when like individual actions like recycling are basically like, you know, not doing anything in comparison to like large corporations polluting places. So but it makes me think about like, okay, well, how do we steward the places in which we live? What does it look like to kind of remediate or kind of compost ideas of being like detached from those processes? Like, how can we like embed ourselves back in that conversation? And I think that is an exciting thing.
Totally.
Yeah, it's like a legacy, you know, like it's not something that you will necessarily reap all the benefits of, but it's like the best way for you to impact global change, global good on whatever scale you can.
Yeah, like I one of the things I really panicked about in buying land upstate was being a landowner, being like a rural gentrifier, being a sort of colonizer. And I was like, wait, or being a settler on stolen land. All of these things are true, and they're all like tensions that this project holds within it. But also you have this opportunity to act on like a scale where you're like, okay, but is it gentrification if all I'm doing is making a space that queers have maybe traditionally not felt welcome or safe for my community? Because that's kind of that puts it on its head a little bit. Am I a settler if I'm trying to just make as much space as possible for all the other creatures that live there? Am I a colonizer if I'm trying to reach out to the indigenous communities that were kicked off this land or like forcibly removed from it? Am I, you know, like, it's like, yes, and there's more.
And if you didn't buy that land, somebody else was going to do it and clear cut it and sell the lumber off, and you know.
Right.
Yeah, it's complicated.
Yeah, I mean, we're all kind of like at the mercy, or we're all like in it. We're in it. we can't get out. That's what I keep thinking. It's like we actually can't get out of it.
We're working in capitalism, so you have to manipulate capitalism to the best of our advantage.
You put it very succinctly there, Benjy. I like that. I just want to note for everyone listening that we're going to open up the floor for questions. So if you have anything percolating, get your fingies ready to type them out. I'm interested to hear a little bit about I don't know, like having spent some time in rural spaces, like what are the possibilities of queers in rural spaces look like in the future to you? Like what are the possibilities of that have perhaps been untapped?
Well, I personally, when I moved to Tennessee, it was to start an artist residency program, like out in the woods, just invite all of our friends out to make art. And we had like an amazing 3 or 4 year run of that. And it was fantastic. That ended in 2011 or so. And I'm currently working on building studios here to start a queer artist residency program that, hopefully will carry on after I'm done, and will still hold space in the country for queer people, like BIPOC folks, trans folks who don't get to while out in nature or in the creek or just tromp off through the woods whenever they want. That was probably the best part of the residency program that we did run, is watching everybody's brains explode when they just had unfettered access to acres and acres of creeks and woods and streams, and they didn't have to worry about anything. So I think the bar that we have to set is you have to create spaces that are safe for Black, brown, and trans bodies, and that's the bar. And then you have to work from that, because Black, brown, and trans bodies do not necessarily feel welcome out here, especially in rural areas, especially with the uptick and all the hate speech and what's going on in politics. It's should be the number one thing we work for.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
And we make it a priority on the land to host opportunities for learning and also big collaborative projects that kind of center Black, queer, and trans voices. So that even if it's a project that I didn't start or that Ben didn't start, we invite people to come to the land and start their thing, make it happen, because it's really important to us that this is a piece of land that people can feel safe in, and also feel like the possibility for creative intervention or building their own practice is theirs too, in that space.
Yeah, I think something that you're tapping into and thinking about creating safe space for Black, brown, trans folks is kind of the political assumptions tied to kind of rural spaces. And I certainly had some fears moving to Omaha, which have fortunately not been, realized in any kind of deeply feeling unsafe or encountering violence for myself. But it sounds like this process of trying to unlearn that association of rurality as an unsafe space for queer people is a really important one. Folks in the audience, feel free to tap in some questions. I have a few more as we're going. While you guys are, we have one here, so I'll privilege that before myself because I've been talking a lot. Hi, Katie. I love this discussion and hearing from Benjy and Patrick about their practices and projects. I wonder if they have art in process coming up that they are ready to share something about. Plug yourselves.
Patrick, you go ahead.
Well, I know that Mothball is going to happen again, so I can let everyone know when that is going to happen. I imagine that in the future, it's not just a one evening event, but it's like a run of theatrical performances over the course of, like you would do a play. But my next project that I'm working on, I've become really obsessed with natural building processes. I'm learning how to timber frame, and from a bunch of friends are teaching a bunch of us how to do it on our land. And between that and learning a little bit about cob for a project I was working on, I'm kind of thinking about living architecture that decomposes into the earth. So I'd really love to make some spaces that look like giant cakes, and the cakes are for the earth. So we don't eat them, we just hang out in them, and then eventually they go back into the earth. So I'm working on that, and I am going to install a cake for the earth, hopefully, next summer in Casanova, New York, which at a sculpture park there.
Oh, cool. Very cool.
Mhm.
Well, I just had this huge show that came down, so I am not quite jumping to embark on a whole bunch of new work. I mean, I'm constantly making stuff, but I've got a show coming up in Australia that's happening during their Pride in January, February. But they invited all these like queer Indigenous artists from different continents and stuff to show work that deals with like language and text and all the different iterations it takes. And then what else is going on? I just had a book published that dealt with the show that I had here at the house. And the show kind of dealt with a lot with my husband who had passed away, us sharing this house together. And then during the pandemic, how he kind of started coming back around and taking up space and being all flirty and stuff again. So that just came out. That's pretty much it. I'm working on a guest room right now. So like before the artist residency gets finished, I can like house my friends that are artists, so I can figure out what I need to do in order to like safely and like, efficiently house artists of all different needs, of all different mediums, boundaries that I need to set. So by the time the residency is launched, I don't have to test drive it on anybody.
Benjy, where can we find that book?
Mhm.
There is a link. Actually, the first run sold out in like a day or two. I have probably like 8
Humble
copies.
brag.
I have like 8 copies left. Holler at me.
Okay.
Or I can send you pictures I take with my phone.
Listen, audience at home, I get one of those 8 copies.
Oh, cool. Yeah, totally.
Awesome. We love hearing about what y'all have coming up. And a little bragging too, that's important. Well, unless there's other questions from the audience, I was wondering, as we were talking about creating like safe spaces, I have a thought about like what have been some of your encounters, or have you had encounters with folks who maybe, I don't know, the communities that are there, like how are they perceiving your creative endeavors, and what do those conversations look like?
You mean with like the greater local community, or like the
Mm-hmm.
The local rural community in Tennessee doesn't really seek out a lot of art or understanding of art. So there's not a whole lot of exchange there. Yeah, the queer community loves it. They're huge fans of weirdo gay art.
We have had a pretty interesting time because our 11 acres is right outside of a very small town, the very small town of Athens. You can actually walk to town from our land if you're like not afraid of speeding country roads. When we did Mothball, we kind of interfaced with a local arts organization, the Athens Cultural Council, And so people affiliated with that have come and seen what we've been doing. But I would say it's been really interesting because the way that our land is shaped, you can't see our neighbors on either side, but you can kind of hear them. It's kind of a long, narrow rectangle, and narrow being a relative term, but pretty narrow. And we have had some very interesting rural neighbor encounters since we've moved there. Some of which have been incredibly heartening and so cool, and drew upon all of my years of experience dealing with like folks in Central Virginia, and having to pull out like, oh, my dad was in the military, and to like find common ground. And then others of which have been like totally a little like terrifying. And so navigating that, I would say that like I always kind of joke that like one of the things that I didn't know I was going to be dealing with when I was starting a land project was my own white masculinity, and the way that that makes it easier for me to do this project in relation to our neighbors, and also the ways in which I am constantly interfacing with white men, like straight white men, in a way that I really never had before. Because they're like, if we need a guy with an excavator, if we like have if we need the driveway plowed, like it always ends up bringing that energy into the space inevitably. And it's been really, really weird.
Mm-hmm.
And heartening and cool, but also weird.
I know, having to worry about like dropping your voice and like talking slower, it's so annoying.
Yeah, I mean, very early on, we had a guy who, when we were trying to make the gravel driveway, come out and look at me and Ben, and like, he was like, but which one of you owns this place? Like, who's paying for this?
Oh my God.
And we were like, we do. And it's just been an interesting, like, even as a white cis gay man, where everyone is like, you have all of the things, which I do, like all of the things that make my life, like I pass in the hierarchies that we all have to encounter. And but it was interesting to have this moment of being like, I don't pass all the time. And it's very like present in a rural space.
Mm-hmm. Totally. I fail at masculinity every day, but that doesn't stop me from trying when I feel threatened by men.
Fight or flight.
Yeah, like no one's buying like my earrings and like a crop top being like, yeah, I got this. Like no one's
hella much.
Well, we're kind of like coming up on the hour, and I'm curious to kind of a lot of what you shared was like really inspiring and enchanting in many ways. Like what advice would you give to queer folks who are wanting to spend more time in rural spaces, maybe start their own community? What advice would you give?
Visit some communities. If you have access to it, just like dip in and see how people have already tried to build the wheel before you rebuild the wheel. So many like communities have a life expectancy of like 15 years before they go kaput, before they get burnt out, before nobody wants to be full-time residents. So the ones that are longer term, they've done a lot of right shit. So I think checking on queer communities who already exist out in rural areas is probably a good place to start.
Yeah, I agree with that. That's definitely how I became more acquainted with this. And I feel like I'd also just say, even if you have all the skills that you think you need, and even if you're like really gung-ho about like going out and making a thing happen, it's really hard. It's way harder than I thought it was going to be. And I thought I was pretty prepared, both because I have an amazing community of skilled friends, many of whom live rurally and have homesteading off-grid projects, and many of whom have like interfaced with like queer rural, long-standing rural communities. But I just didn't even realize, it's like anytime you're embarking on a project of living, regardless of where it is, it gets hard. It gets really hard because there's so many resources involved in living.
Mhm.
Emotional.
So many resources are not plentiful in rural areas. So like you have to import income, you have to import, like other people if you're hosting folks. There's not a lot of resources in the rural areas.
Yeah, or even just like if you're coming from an urban space, like having to navigate driving at night on dark country roads. It's so scary.
They're not two-lane. They say they're two-lane, but they are not two-lane.
No, it's terrifying. And there's deer everywhere where we are. They're just
Yeah.
like jumping out and running and coming at every angle. So I guess I just think like jump in. The water's great, and have your wits about you and your community, hold your community close, and also email me or get in touch with somebody who's trying it. Benjy.
Yeah, like, I love to talk about it.
Me too. And come visit, see what we're doing wrong. Like, because most of the time
we'll give you a long list of things not to do.
Yeah. You'll come and you'll be like, wow, I'm never doing it like that.
Yeah.
And that will be helpful. So, but please come. We love to have people there. I think I can count on one hand the number of weekends or times that Ben and I have been there just with the two of us. It's like in the years that we've done it, it's the thing that's so cool about rural living is when there's lots of people.
Yes, definitely.
Cool. Thank you for that. I'm like, I don't know if we can think about some of these like separatist queer gestures as a kind of like gesture of refusal. I'm thinking about how a lot of times refusal is invisible. And I think I'm so appreciative and grateful for this conversation to shed some light and in the nitty-gritty and the inspiring aspects of the projects that you're working on. So thank you for your generosity, thoughtfulness, and sensitivity. I've really appreciated it.
Oh, thank you for inviting us. This was amazing.
Yeah, this is so fun. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and shout out to Peter. Amplify again.
Areas is so important. Yeah, we can't just like flee rural areas because it's getting harder. It makes it more impossible to move back out. So definitely queer people in rural areas for the win.
Let's do it. Let's take over.
Yeah, for the win.
Cool. Well, it's been such a pleasure. Thank you both. Thank you, Peter and Amplify, and all of everyone tuning in. Everyone have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye.